All right. Here is a story from my hometown, Memphis, Tennessee. That's where I was born and raised. And I know exactly where this guy's talking about. Matter of fact, I grew up real close to this area, not exactly, right around the corner, but it was about 5 miles from where I lived. And we spent a lot of time down on those Wolf River bottoms. But let's get on with this story. It's really good. I hope you guys enjoy it. If this does find its way, let me back up. The man wants to be anonymous. He's about to say this in the letter, but I feel like I need to qualify that. If this does find its way to your broadcast, I would ask you refrain from using my name. I'm still active in my line of work, mainly as a consultant. This restricts me from publishing this type of information due to clearance concerns. And even though this doesn't fall under any of that, it's better to be safe than sorry. I recently came across your YouTube channel, Dixiecryptid, and have absolutely loved the stories. Oh, dude, thanks. I'm fortunate to have found it at just the right time because you were starting your podcast series, What If It's True? So I started that podcast back 1.5 years ago, so this letter is 1.5 years old. And yes, you can listen to all of these episodes plus about 40 more podcasts at the What If It's True podcast. Whatever podcast app you use, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, there's a million of them out there. Just do a search for What If It's True podcast, and it'll be right at the top of the list. But again, back to the letter. It was also amazing to find that you and I are both originally from the same area, growing up in East Memphis, and are around the same age. There's no telling how many times when we probably ran into each other through being in the same place or through family and friends and never knew it. That's why I wanted to share this story with you. It is one of many I have encountered over the years, but takes place in an area you will be familiar with and can understand the geography of the location, and what surrounds it, and what goes on down there, or what possibly used to go on down there. This took place in Memphis at the Wolf River bottoms in 1988. I can't recall the exact day, but I'm sure it was during the week and not the weekend, and it was around 2 a.m. Growing up, my family were no strangers to what I would classify as paranormal events. Now, don't get me wrong, these were not everyday occurrences or anything like that, but we probably had a bit more than our normal share. I tell you this because it later plays into the story somewhat. However, most of that activity was either spirit-related or fall someplace within the psychic realm. I did have one UFO encounter back in 1977. I spotted a triangle craft over the house. The whole neighborhood saw that one. It was spotted all over Memphis and even made the news way back then. I state this to let you all know I'm no stranger to non-normal events and have encountered many through the years, mostly due to my career. Again, more stories are coming. I'm going to have to check his email account and see if I've got anything else from him, because he's a pretty good writer, and I haven't even got into this story. Even to this day, I still find it fascinating and do a lot of research on these topics. And one thing I have never encountered that I'm aware of is what would be classified as a cryptid, unless the creature I'm about to tell you about classifies as a cryptid. I will let you be the judge on that. I have my own theory, but I'm not going to throw it out there just yet because it may spoil the coming story. I started my lifelong career in Memphis as a police officer back in the mid-'80s, but it didn't take long for my career to take off, and it eventually required me to move from there. However, while still living and working in Memphis, I had this brief encounter while coming back from a special assignment in which I was working. It was during the summer and around 2 a.m. It was a clear night and it was hot. Not just hot, but Mississippi Delta hot. That means along with the heat, it was very humid. Anyone who has ever spent any summertime in this area can understand that. It's very heavy, hot atmosphere that you almost need gills in order to catch your breath. I was in my personal vehicle, which was a brand new Chevy Camaro. I had the T-tops off and the radio was blaring. I was still in my uniform, including my bulletproof vest and a gun belt with all the regular equipment attached to it. I had already stopped and got myself a soft drink, and I was using the breeze to cool me down from the hot night of work. I was heading south on Covington Pike at a good rate of speed, and the only one on the road. Covington Pike runs through the northeast side of Memphis, and this part of the road connects the Raleigh-Bartlett area to the Berkeley area. I grew up in the Berkeley area, by the way. Also, on this part of Covington Pike, the road is slightly elevated as the surrounding area is low, and running through it is the Wolf River, which a few miles from here connects to the Mississippi River. This area is commonly referred to by the locals as the Wolf River Bottoms. These days, this area of Covington Pike has been developed and is now chock full of car lots, strip malls, fast food joints, and such. But back in the 80s, this area was mostly remote and it had only a few scattered businesses, none of which were near the Wolf River Bottoms. The Bottoms is one of those places that teenagers and young adults would gather at with four-wheelers, jeeps, motocross bikes, and such, would go to have fun, and as we called it, we went mudding. Also on the weekends, it was a well-known make-out spot and a place to hang out and drink and smoke and do other nefarious activities. However, at 2 a.m. on a weeknight, it was quiet with no activity going on. Also running parallel to the river and wooded area known as the Bottoms is Interstate 40. It is even more elevated than Covington Pike. I-40 runs over the top of Covington Pike, and there is an exit and entrance ramp to the interstate. This is also right at the spot you can pull off the Covington Pike and drive down into the Bottoms. I was approaching this area pretty fast and looking over at the side of the road to my left, where the side of the road goes down into the Bottoms, and I could see what appeared to be a very bright light breaking through the tree line back in the woods, but my vision was obstructed to see the vehicle producing the light. My first thought was that it was some hardcore guys down in the Bottoms going mudding this time of the morning, and they had some killer spotlights mounted on their ride to light up such an area. As this was going on, and I was still fast approaching the I-40 viaduct, something caught my attention and my peripheral vision over to my right just outside my headlight beams. It was moving fast directly toward the front of my car. Well, I immediately slammed on the brakes while thinking, oh shit, a deer running across the road. But I couldn't have been more wrong. It came to a screeching halt right in the middle of the road, right in front of my headlights, not more than 7 feet from my bumper. As we were both froze in place staring at each other, and I'm not sure had the bigger oh shit expression, me or it. At least that is, if the thing I was looking at was human, then that's the expression I would have guessed was on its face. It only stopped and froze in front of me for probably no more than about 10 seconds, but it was a 10-second period that seemed like lasting for minutes. I can only assume this, but perhaps with the oddity of the moment or fast reaction of stopping the car before I hit something, what I would call my police mode kicked in, and I began to mentally take note of the situation and went into observation mode. I started taking notice of the suspect in front of me. It appeared to be 3 to 4 feet tall, but was also crouched. It could have been closer to 5 if it stood straight up, but I got the impression that its current body posture was its normal way of standing. It had a large head, at least compared to its skinny, slender body. The color of the head seemed a bit darker than the rest, all of which appeared to be dark gray and greenish in color. Similar to the color of American alligators, but the appearance of its skin looked like a similar texture to humans. Y'all, my rooster's raising sand out there. Just ignore him. It was shaped the same and had dark, large oval-type eyes on each side of the upper part of its face, running slanted from the top portion of its head to about the midsection of its head. It was kind of pointing inward to where you would expect a nose to be. However, from what I could tell, there was no distinct nose, at least none like a human. Below the eyes was a very thin, dark, almost black line, which I assumed was its mouth. It ran from about the same location a human's mouth would be. However, the line ran straight across the lower face in front and then turned upward and slightly back on the head, almost to the area you would expect the ears to be. It never opened its mouth or made any sound, so I'm not sure if that entire area opened or if it was a mouth at all. It could have been discolored from the rest of the skin. It had no ears that I could see or even any discernible ear holes, at least where you would expect them. The neck was slightly more elongated and smaller than a human's running down its body, and the chest area was rounded like a human but vastly smaller, almost like a child. Its arms appeared to be longer and somewhat disproportionate to its body, and they were skinny and had an insect-type look to them. Not so much an exoskeleton look, but obviously jointed. They weren't hanging down as you would expect someone standing there to have them, but kind of folded up on each side of its body. It was a bit like in a relaxed boxer stance, but with the hands turned in toward it and not at me. I could make out hands, but they were also completely folded at the wrist joint against its forearms, so I'm not sure what they actually looked like. The legs were long, because even with this thing's shortness, I could make out the top of them even with it so close to the bumper, which was obscuring the bottom half somewhat. They were like the arms, thin and insect-like, but it appeared to be jointed the same way, but to have the upper part of the leg shorter than the bottom part of the leg. I could not see its lower leg, its shins, or its feet area to determine what they looked like. I did notice its chest area moving slightly like it was breathing, but it seemed slow and steady. If I was racing up that 20 to 30 foot embankment, even in the shape I was in back then, I would have been sucking wind too. I never noticed anything like genitalia to determine if it had a particular sex identification, and I didn't see scars or anything like that. There was no hair any place that I could see, and I'm not even sure if it was wearing any type of clothing. If it was, it would have had to have been skin tight. My focus was on its head and my adrenaline was pumping, and it was only a brief period of observation, so I probably missed quite a bit. Then it turned its head quickly as if it either saw or heard something coming from the area that it was running toward, and took off like a shot. It was out of my headlights now, and I could still make out its outline in the darkness, and it was moving like an Olympic sprinter. It leaped over a guardrail onto the other side of the road and down the other side of the embankment toward the area that I saw the light coming from. I don't know why, other than I'm so used to pursuing suspects when they would run from me, but I popped open my car door and I was on my way out of the car to pursue it. There was no way in hell that I was going to be able to catch this thing, especially wearing all my gear, a bulletproof vest, and in this humidity, I thought to myself, but I gotta try. I made it halfway out of the car when I thought to myself, stop. So I stopped. Then I thought to myself, following this thing is dangerous to you. We need to move along. So I got back in my car and put it in drive, and I started to go. I made it several feet to just under the interstate overpass, and then I was thinking to myself, man, this isn't right. So I stopped the car again. But before I could get back out of the car, again, I thought to myself, you need to stop and give this up. And then I thought to myself, again, following this thing is dangerous to you. You need to move along. Again, I put the car in drive and I hit the gas and I left. I drove a quarter of a mile and I pulled over on Macon Road. I sat there for a bit trying to gather myself enough to check my sanity. Did this just happen? Yep. Did I see what I saw? Yep. Why would I just drive away from that? Why would I tell myself it's too dangerous when nothing during the encounter felt threatening to me? It's weird, yes, it's very strange, but was it dangerous? And why would I think to myself in those words when I never generally use phrasing that way or refer to myself as if I was someone else saying that to myself? Did I just get a Jedi mind trick pulled on me? Perhaps it was trying to save me? Was there something I missed? Was it possibly chasing something else? Something more dangerous? All of this was going through my mind at that time. One thing I know from my training is that witness observations deteriorate quickly. I'm also paranoid now that if it was not me thinking this, and I'm still battling that issue till today, could I somehow have this stripped from my memory? So, time for documentation. I pulled out my notebook that I use for documenting my police activity, and I wrote down everything I could remember. Another thing I know from my past experiences with dealing with supernatural entities is to only share with those who you can relate to so it doesn't tarnish your public life. I then tore out those pages out of my notebook and I kept them till this day. Finally, after about 30 minutes of documenting and de-stressing, I turned around and I went back. I found exactly what I expected to find. Not a damn thing. No creature, no lights in the woods, nothing other than the skid marks where I slammed on the brakes. I called my brother the next day after getting zero sleep that night. After that, how could I? My brother has also experienced prior paranormal stuff, some with me and some apart from me, but he was older and he had been involved with and researching this kind of thing for some time, and I needed to trust the source. Remember, this was the 80s and way before the internet. He wasn't too sure about the creature, but it didn't fall into the realm of what is known today as your garden variety cryptid. He started leaning more towards spiritual beings, I think probably because it is in more of his wheelhouse than anything else. But I had my doubts about that. This thing was solid. It was three-dimensional. And even though it's putting human expressions on something that's not human, I can't shake the feeling that it was caught off guard and freaked out momentarily as I was. It was as if I surprised it. I've never heard of a person surprising a spirit, a demon, or something intangible. It's usually the other way around. My brother is also in a very small circle of people that I have ever told about this encounter, until now. I'm curious and I still seek possible answers to what I did encounter that night, and now that I can kind of relax some on reporting this now, perhaps someone out there has had similar experiences or has also run across one of these beings. Any help or a point in a direction would be appreciated. As of now, with some of the research I've been able to do, my thought is this may have been an extraterrestrial encounter. Perhaps the light I saw was from a craft it was trying to get back to or some parallel dimension doorway. There's also an active train railway that runs through there, and it may have just been a locomotive that was passing by when this occurred. I've seen other trains passing through there, but I don't ever recall the light being that bright, but who knows? There are also stories from Indian tribes of the ant people who dwell deep inside the earth, so there's a lot to think about with this. Today, I reside in the Middle Tennessee area, and I'm now retired law enforcement, and I've worked for several agencies, both local and federal, in various capacities, mainly with specialized units. I would like to say that this encounter was my last supernatural encounter during my career and lifetime, but there have been a few others, but those are stories from another time. That's the end of his email. Oh, wasn't that a good story? Now, the way he described this thing, I don't think it's a Bigfoot. I don't think it's your typical Bigfoot. But I've heard, and I've never read anything about it, but I've just heard the word lizard man. The lizard man. Maybe it was a lizard man. But I would tend more to think that what he saw was extraterrestrial. And I don't remember a train track running through that area. He said, I spent a lot of time down in those bottoms in my Jeep and trucks and drinking beer and smoking cigarettes and other stuff. And having a great time down in those bottoms in the summertime. And there were always hundreds of people down there, and it was just a big party for kids. I haven't driven through there in years, so I don't know if there's still that access that was once there. If you were heading north on Covington Pike, I think Covington Pike runs north and south. You went under I-40, about 200 yards down on your right, there's a little drop off, and it was paved, and it went back in there. I don't know why they paved it. Maybe it was access for borrowing dirt to build the overpass or something. I don't know, but that's where everybody would congregate. And then the trails just dropped off that road in several different places. And at the end, it made a hard left and it went way back in those bottoms. And there were just miles and miles of trails back there. And I spent many a dark night back there pulling buddies out. I had a winch on a Jeep. Jeeps are horrible for mudding, by the way. I used to think they were the baddest things around, but Jeeps are horrible for mudding. But I could get back there and I could winch them out, and I never saw anything crazy back there, and I spent a lot of dark nights back there, driving back through there by myself to get to my buddies and trying to find them and pull them out. Anyway, I'm just kind of rambling on about that, but I just thought this was an interesting story, not necessarily a Bigfoot story. Maybe it's, again, an extraterrestrial lizard man kind of thing. I don't know, but it was a great story, And I'd love to get more emails from this gentleman, and I hope he sends them. It did take me a year and a half to get to this, but that's kind of how it's going. I have a lot of stories to do, but hang on, I'm gonna get to all of them, or I'm gonna do my darndest. All right, let's go to another story. My name is Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid podcast, and welcome to another podcast. Hope you enjoyed that first story. The videos you're seeing in this podcast or this video are videos sent to me by my good friend Todd. He lives out west, and he actually sent me 2 SD cards. He spent a fortune to mail them to me. And I just wanted in this podcast to thank him for sending those. He wouldn't take any money. If he would just give me his PayPal address, I'll send him some money for these and at least reimburse for the SD cards and the shipping. But thanks, Todd, for these. And he's always been a huge help to this channel. And I've never talked to him. We just communicate through emails, and he sent a few stories, and they're not his own stories, they're secondhand stories, and that's what he does. He collects these. So anyway, I just wanted to let y'all know that he sets up these trail cams, and he gets all these great videos, and he was so nice to send these for everyone to enjoy. All right, let's jump back into the podcast. I appreciate you guys clicking on this video. Let's get rolling. All right, here we go. All right, here's a story. The man gave it a title. He doesn't say whether to reveal his name or not, so I won't. But he calls this the Peeping Hairy Man. And the encounter takes place in Arkansas. This is pretty good. He writes, my encounter took place in the Arkansas National Forest of Northwest Arkansas. But before I tell you my story, I'd like to give you some background about myself. My family roots run deep in the Ozark Mountains of Northwest Arkansas, but I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and I was raised as a NASA brat. My father, in his youth, as his father and his father before that, lived and worked on the land just outside of Goshen, Arkansas, just a few minutes' drive east of Fayetteville. My father sought a life outside of the farm life and was known to read his share of science fiction novels as a teenager. He was fascinated with anything outer space. He later attended the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, and he acquired a PhD in geology. He then moved to Pasadena, California to do graduate studies, and a short time later he took a job at NASA as a scientist at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. During the Apollo missions, one of his early tasks was to study the moon rocks that were brought back. He would sometimes sneak me into his NASA lab located on the top story of the NASA building that made space food, amongst other things. His office was in Building 31 and his lab was in Building 34, if I remember all this correctly. The building next door to his lab was where the Saturn rockets were constructed. And upon one visit, I actually saw the moon rocks firsthand. So having lived the Apollo missions firsthand, it gave me an open mind to the unknown. As a teenager growing up in the outside suburbs of Houston, I was also able to make my way into the great outdoors. I was a Boy Scout, and we would take numerous camping trips throughout Texas, the hill country and the piney woods alike. My mother's parents owned a ranch in northeast Texas, and it was a frequent family destination for holidays and sometimes just for a family vacation. I learned how to fish, hunt, and pitch a tent and basic survival skills at the early age, and I would often take treks into the woods by myself without a care in the world. Thinking back on certain events that happened back then, I now look back on it with a different viewpoint, mostly because what I'm about to tell you is my later experience in the Ozark National Forest at night, and it has profoundly changed the way I look at my life. I moved to Northwest Arkansas in 2004. I was burnt out with the status quo of what Texas life had for me, and I was looking for a change. My parents had since divorced, and my brother and mother had moved to Rays Mill, Arkansas. They had already run into the hills, and now it was my turn. Their house, along with the small house behind, is on several acres of land. There was once a mill there, hence the name Rays Mill. That spot was where the Union Army during the Civil War was stationed during the Battle of Prairie Grove. My brother has even unearthed a cannonball on their land. Shortly after I moved to Northwest Arkansas, I would frequently fish at a small local lake just down from Rays Mill, and I would often park my truck a short walking distance from the dam and then walk up and over the dam and then fish from the dam bank. On a later visit, hoping I would have better luck bagging some brim, I began to work my way off the dam and into some thick brush and trees to get to the larger boulder protruding over the lake's bank. As I approached the tree line, I began to have an eerie feeling. It came over me out of nowhere. Now, I've been in the woods alone many times before and have never felt the jeepers creepers. I quickly grabbed my rod and reel along with my tackle box, and I made it back to my truck. I've not been back to Lincoln Lake since. A year later, around 2006, I was working and living in Springdale. I was 45 minutes from my mom's. I had just gone into business for myself, and I was single, and I lived alone. I would often get bored, and I was known to take drives throughout the mountains and sometimes even at night. I had an older model Chevy Suburban 4-wheel drive that I had jazzed up with some awesome stereo speakers. I found that late night cruises while listening to some tunes was quite soothing. I would often take cruises to my mother's and stop in to say hello and rob her refrigerator. One late night, I decided I need to get out for a cruise. I was going to head to Mom's. I started down the freeway and then exited off onto Highway 16. It's a 2-lane highway that resembles a roller coaster. I continued down Highway 16 20 miles, and then I turned left onto Weddington Blacktop. It was County Road 33, and then it would just be another 10 miles or so before turning off to get to Mom's. I crossed the Illinois River Bridge and made a sharp curve to the left. It went up a steep hill and then entered the Ozark National Forest. It was dark, only my headlights lighting up what little road that had constant turning of my truck to stay in the unstraight and winding road ahead of me. No shoulders on this highway, not like Texas road that I was used to driving, and very little in the way of road stripping. There were tall trees to my left, and at the time there was no cell service. I was smack dab in the middle of nowhere. It was paradise, I thought. The road began to wind sharply downhill and to the left, and I could now see the beginnings of water to the left of me as the road leveled off. I had reached Weddington Lake, and as I began to climb up the next hill, I remembered there was a small pull-off lookout to my left, and I needed to go to the bathroom. I pull my Suburban over across the incoming lane and onto the lookout shoulder, and I left my motor running along with my headlights. I stepped out, leaving my truck door open, and I began to relieve myself. To the right of me, there was somewhat of a cliff overseeing a small pond on the opposite side of the lake, which was to my left, and I found myself fixated on that ridgetop. Then I had this overwhelming feeling come over me. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up, and goosebumps were running down my arms, and a strong feeling that someone or something was watching me. I was standing outside of a lit-up truck smack dab in the middle of nowhere, and I was a sitting duck. I whipped it back into my pants before... Oh, guys. Okay, I'll leave that in. I whipped it back into my pants before finishing and threw it in the drive, and I burnt rubber up the hill. Eventually, I shook it off as nothing. Man, you've just got all kind of innuendos in this story. Some years later, I had married and had become a daddy. My family and I went hiking through the same lake, but on the other side. We eventually made it to a rock-covered enclosure and the Parks and Recreation had built some years back. Those same eerie feelings came back. Something wasn't right. I kept it to myself, and we finished our day of fun. A short time later, I found myself researching Bigfoot sightings in Arkansas. And guess what? A sighting had been documented in that same area just prior to my roadside event. I also read of a sighting of a red-headed Bigfoot digging in the sand underneath a bridge along the Illinois River. And come to find out, sightings had been documented all over this area dating back years. I then began to think of my childhood, and the things began to add up. Like the time my grandmother would tell my brother and I as kids not to venture back into certain parts of the wooded areas. The times Grandpa's bird dogs would go into a barking frenzy in the middle of the night, and he would step outside shooting his shotgun into the air. I can't adventure into the woods much anymore, certainly not alone and certainly not at night. I'm a believer, so say what you will. When you know, you know. That's the end of his email. And I don't know that this man didn't see anything. He just had a feeling. This whole email, this whole experience is about a feeling he had. He never heard anything, never smelled anything, never saw anything, never encountered anything. He just had a creepy feeling. And I don't think that would keep me from going in the woods. I would just kind of, myself, I would write that off as just a creepy feeling from somewhere. Not being critical, I'm just saying this is such a generic story and so little evidence that, but it was a good story. I mean, he had some funny parts to it. It was pretty good. And maybe it could be a Bigfoot. I'm not ruling that out. I'm just saying I need to see it if I'm going to stay out of the woods, because I love being in the woods and on the water and hunting and fishing and having fun. I'm going to have to see something or feel real threatened by something I can hear, smell, or see to stay out of the woods. But that's just me. That's just me. All right, we got one more story. All right, this gentleman doesn't give me the permission to say his name. He may at some point in here tell me that it's okay or not, but I'm not going to do it. But he does give this story a title, and it's called 47-Year-Old Mystery Solved. I hope you and your listeners find my story interesting, but first a little background. I come from a long line of outdoorsmen. After his service as an Army Scout and guide during the Civil and Indian Wars, my great-grandfather migrated to what is now Red Lodge, Montana, where he was one of Montana's pioneering cattle ranchers. My father and grandfather were born and raised in Red Lodge, which sits at the foot of the Beartooth Mountain Range, where both men developed an avid love for the mountains and the wilderness. I was born in Butte, Montana, and I was raised in Missoula, where my parents passed on their love of the outdoors to my three brothers and I. Family was the most important thing to my parents, and it showed in the lifestyle that they provided us. Everyone should be so lucky as to have experienced the childhood that I enjoyed. Dad had his own business and reserved weekends for family time. My earliest memories are of the weekends spent camping at one of the many lakes within an hour or two of Missoula. When I was a teenager, Mom and Dad bought some land on a lake in the Swan Valley where we built a cabin, and from that day forward, every weekend, year-round, from Friday until Sunday evening, we spent at the cabin enjoying the lake and exploring the surrounding mountains and the forest. Lily, what are you barking at? Lily. That's my little junkyard dog, Pug. She'll bite your leg off. Get him, Lily. Get him. Go get that guy. Go get him. Go bite his leg off. I'm sorry. I made my first trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in the summer of my 14th year, and what an incredible adventure that was. My point is that I'm quite familiar with the flora and fauna of western Montana. My first exposure to Sasquatch was when my parents took me and my brothers to see the Patterson film as he was touring it around in the Northwest. I remember leaving there with this strange feeling of wonder. I don't remember the family ever discussing the film or Sasquatch afterward, and soon it was relegated to the deepest recesses of my mind. In 1975, I married a city girl from the suburbs of Chicago. We met while she was living with her aunt in Missoula and attending the local college. That girl took to the outdoor lifestyle like she had been doing it her whole life. And shortly after our wedding, we made a trip to the local sporting goods store and bought the camping equipment we needed to enjoy what quickly became one of our favorite pastimes. For our first outing together as newlyweds, I decided I wanted to camp somewhere new, so we headed for the Swan Valley with no particular destination in mind. Now keep in mind that the Swan Valley is the third largest intact ecosystem in the lower 48 states. 15 minutes north of Seeley Lake, I noticed a sign pointing the way to a lake I was not familiar with. I was going too fast to make the turn, so I continued on until I found a safe place to turn around, and I returned to the road, if you could call it that. It was a little more than 2 tracks wandering off through the forest in the direction the sign pointed. Although Highway 83 runs the full length of the Swan Valley, at the time north of Seeley Lake was quite sparsely populated and could be a lonely drive, particularly at night. I followed the winding tracks leading to the lake that turned out to be only about a quarter mile from the highway. Although being serviced by Highway 83, this area was and remains to this day quite remote. I approached the lake, and we were presented with the perfect campsite. Stretching out before us was a pristine mountain meadow nestled alongside a brush-lined mountain lake. It was quite obvious the area got very little use, as there weren't even the remains of a campfire anywhere. We pitched our camp, and Sasquatch was the furthest thing from our minds. We set up our tent, and we organized our gear, and then we relaxed by the lake, drinking in the clear mountain air laced with the scent of wildflowers that dotted our little slice of heaven. For me, being in the deep forest is a truly spiritual experience. It's times like that when one can feel how connected our natural world is. Dinner time came, and we prepared a meal of fresh lake trout that we had caught earlier that afternoon, and after dinner we reclined by the fire until the sun disappeared behind the mountain and night descended on our little meadow hideaway. After retiring to our tent for the night, we both fell fast asleep. Sometime later that night, I was awakened by the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I have to admit, I was more than a little disturbed as I lay there wondering what on earth could make such a sound. Anyone that has spent much time in the backcountry knows that a loud sound in the distance in a heavily wooded area is kind of a muffled echo. Well, this was not the case with this scream. It was the loudest, highest-pitched scream one could imagine, and there was no muffled echo. Whatever it was had to be quite close. There were a couple of more screams, and then there was silence. As I lay nervously pondering what on earth critter could make such a noise, it dawned on me just how quiet things had become. And I have to say that I'm not sure if the seeming quiet was because of the noise, whatever had made it, and it lent a new dimension to the night that made the normal night sound seem insignificant, or if it was actually as quiet as it seemed. And then the wood knocking started. And again, I found myself wondering what on earth could be making that sound. Sounded like two baseball bats being knocked together with great force. There were a couple of more knocks, and then once again silence, or at least it seemed so. I lay there trying to decipher just what woodland creature would make these incredible sounds. And through all this, my wife didn't stir in the least. I'm not sure if she heard what I had heard or not, but she gave no indication that she was awake and I wasn't about to disturb her. I was more than a little shook up by the whole experience, but after a few minutes I concluded it was just some forest creature that I was not familiar with, and I settled myself down and was soon fast asleep. I never spoke to anyone, including my wife, about that experience until a couple of years ago, and had completely forgotten about that night altogether. About that time, I had started watching videos and researching Sasquatch. I found the topic quite interesting and the various stories fascinating. One evening, I was watching a video about Sasquatch when they played what they claimed were Sasquatch vocalizations, and the memories of that night came flooding back. What I was hearing being played sounded almost exactly like what I had heard 47 years ago. They also played wood knocking just like what I had also experienced that night all those years ago. After realizing that what I had heard was quite possibly a Sasquatch, I had the most awful, unsettling feeling in my gut, and it didn't subside for 3 days. After 2 years now of watching videos and listening to the stories and researching Sasquatch, I've come to the conclusion that Sasquatch, like all western Montana predators, can be dangerous but are rarely a threat to humans. One of the most curious conclusions I have come to is they seem to have a sense of humor and enjoy messing with humans, as demonstrated by the harmless act of throwing pine cones and small stones near campers as they gather around a campfire at night. As I recall other unusual experiences I've had in other remote locations of western Montana, I can't help but wonder if I've had more encounters than just that one night in the summer of 1975. And that is a story that a lot of people experience. They hear these stories on this channel and many others that do this now. A lot of people can remember things they heard, things they smelled, even things they saw that didn't add up at the time, and they kind of catalog it back in their mind. And then they hear, like this man heard the scream of what was claimed to be a Sasquatch on a video, and it rang a bell, and he remembered all this stuff, and he's starting to put it all together. And, you know, we've been through this scenario 100 times, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating. All 3 of these stories in this video were great, and they really make you think. They really make you think. They all don't have to be action-packed to be very interesting. It's almost 50 years, and he still remembers it. He's putting it all together. That's great. All right, I'm going to wind this podcast up. Thank you to the writers for sending these stories, and thank you to you for listening. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks a lot.